The Mount Nelson area is picked as a case study area basically because it's typical. It's peri-urban. It has the same range of issues and players and constraints and history that almost any other peri-urban part of Australia has got. When you first examine Mount Nelson, you have to look at the physical framework. So you start off with landform. Okay, it's an elevated ridge. It's lined basically northwest, southeast. Because it's elevated, it gets good fetch and exposure to winds, and it's well known for having high wind speeds up there. You might argue that gives you enhanced evapotranspiration. Certainly, forest types up there, dry sclerophyll, white peppermint in the main, and with grassy going into shrubby understories. The grassy side of things is very much a legacy of old clearing and old fire and old grazing, because this is an area which was in the main settled for small farms and dairying, potatoes, things like that, and then converted over to urban starting from the 60s onwards. So physical frameworks there, and you've got basically only 40 years worth of significant development on the mountain itself. Players on Mount Nelson are really an interesting bunch because you're transitioning from the old to the new. So in the old, you've got your major families that had large farms, and there's very few of those left, but there's one at South Lee. Beside them is the Lee Scout Camp, so you've got a large area there that's basically managed for natural values. You've got a lot of ground which has been resumed by council or come to council, which now forms part of the reserve system inside the Hobart city, and there's also land that's in council ownership on the Kingborough side. Through the middle you've got a major highway called the Southern Outlet, and that's got road reserves on either side, so that the roads department's a major owner as well. And then finally there are a couple of areas at the end of Mount Nelson which are reserves in their own right, and they're managed by the Parks and Wildlife Service. So you've got a range of these large landowners, and then as well as that you've got hundreds of owners of relatively small blocks in the intermix, and then the odds and sods. The University Reserve comes up from the university main campus right up to the top of the mountain, and beside that you've also got a large area of land owned by the Education Department that there's a matriculation college there. So there's even a fire station on Mount Nelson on a very small block of land. So there are a range of owners, and they've all got a view, and what they've been doing with their land is quite variable as well. I suppose if you're looking at the brief and you're looking at the landscape, there's a range of things that are fairly obvious. At the highest level, there is no real strategy for Mount Nelson with respect to fire. Now, there is, in the council records, there'll be bits associated with Mount Nelson planning scheme amendments. There are various other studies that have been done, and they need to be looked at and reviewed to see whether we can see some overwhelming strategies that will come out from this brief. Inside that main strategy of what to do about fire globally across the mountain, then we can say, well, out of that will fall some major elements, and they might be called minor strategies. They'll be more strategic of nature. So it might be, for example, that increasing the number of transport corridors that are available for simultaneous firefighting and evacuation might be seen as a strategic aim, and then inside that various task level things will fall out, like making up road connections and negotiating access to highways and the sort of tactical level things that need to be done and then maintained. one of the things that will be clear when anybody goes through the documentation that's available is that a lot of previous work has been done and things have been commenced that have not been maintained. And so there is a major challenge in these sorts of briefs on how do you set up the work that you do so that it has longevity. So that's one part of it. A major challenge for anybody attempting this is to be able to separate out the competing interests that have occurred through time, because obviously the settlement pattern and the activities that take place on the mountain today are a legacy of a whole range of different decisions and values that have competed through time, contested each other, and ultimately expressed themselves on the landscape. On Mount Nelson, we have communities who live together in space but are separate socially, and to get those people who are facing the same physical environment but have different social understandings of that environment, to then have a comprehensive approach to it is going to be quite difficult, and perhaps is one of the big issues for peri-urban living. So where we go with this really depends on how you tackle the brief, whether you think ultimately that the social side has more strength and more interest to you than the physical environment. Certainly social planners are often going to take the physical environment as a given, whereas those who have perhaps got a bit more of an engineering or land management bent might say, well, hang on, we can modify the environment up here or find somewhere in the middle, which is usually where most planners end up. From time to time, people ask, well, you know, what are our sort of options here? Certainly at the Royal Commission, evidence was given and accepted that removing houses from the landscape is a viable option. Now, it's been tried in a few places, specifically in the western face of the Dandenongs, and sometimes this is called sterilising unkindly or backzoning, if you're trying to be a bit more kind. It usually requires large amounts of money, and it sort of transfers the problem rather than removes it or treats it. So what I'm saying is, if somebody wants a lifestyle that is treed and green and elevated, so you've got a bit of a view, and you've got a reasonable separation between the houses so that you're not looking at your neighbour, and you've got screening and privacy, and you're enjoying that and you want to live that way, well, most of those things are associated with bushfire if you're in the peri-urban environment. So if people want to live that way, then if you say, I'll backzone a certain area, then they will take their demand for living that way to somewhere else. So what we have to actually come to grips with is how to make those sorts of lifestyle values and the pleasures you get from them, how do we make them safe to live in rather than shifting them around the landscape?